I was the witness at my best friend's wedding. The groom looked at me exactly once during the ceremony. I looked away. Ellen saw both. That was 5 years ago. Last Tuesday she knocked on my door. I want to tell you what I understood when she knocked, and then what I understood when she spoke, because the two things are different and the distance between them is the whole of the story. When I heard the knock, I understood that 5 years of silence had ended. Ellen and I had been friends since we were 7 years old. 22 years of shared everything, school and illness and grief and the particular joy of two people who find each other funny in exactly the same ways. We had been friends through everything, and then we had been friends through less, and then we had not spoken in almost 2 years, and I had stopped understanding why. When she knocked, I understood that she had come to say something. I assumed I knew what it was. I assumed it was about the look, about Robert's look during the ceremony and my looking away, and what she had concluded from both of those things in the years since. I assumed she had come to name something that neither of us had named, and I was, as I opened the door, organizing how to explain that there was nothing to name. I was wrong about what she had come to say. I was wrong about all of it, and the wrongness rearranged 5 years in about 10 minutes, which is one of the more disorienting things that has ever happened to me. My name is Clara Marsh. I live in the town of Linden, Colorado, which is where I have lived for 7 years, and where my husband Thomas and I run a small dry goods business, and where I have been for those 7 years in the specific state of a woman who has made a good decision and knows it, and occasionally wonders if good was the only standard she should have been applying. Thomas is a good man. I say this without irony or qualification. He is honest and kind, and he works hard, and he makes me laugh on Tuesdays, which is the day he gets the supply orders wrong and tries to fix them before I notice, which he has never once managed. I am glad I married him. I am content. I did not know, before Ellen came, that content was a word I had been using to avoid a different word. Let me be precise about this, because I think it is important and because I have spent 5 years being imprecise about it. I did not have a longing for Robert. I want to say this clearly because it is true, and because the events I am describing might suggest otherwise. What I had, standing in that church on a Tuesday in June of 1880, was not desire for someone else's groom. What I had was grief, the particular grief of watching a person you love choose something that isn't right for them, and understanding that you are not the right person to say so, and saying nothing. The grief was for Ellen, not for myself, and what I did not understand for 5 years was that Ellen had read it differently. The 5 years between the wedding and her knock on my door had a shape that I had watched from a careful distance. Ellen and Robert had moved into the house on Birch Street that Robert had rented before the wedding. A good house, a proper house, the kind that looked like the beginning of a settled life. I had seen them at church and at the general store and at the occasional community dinner, and what I had seen was what you see when two people are being correct with each other. The right gestures,
Robert,
the right words, the right
I do.
surface. I had thought it
Do
was the
you,
settling
Ellen?
in of a
Take
new
Robert.
marriage and had waited for it to warm. It had not warmed. What I had watched instead, in the years that followed, was a slow and polite diminishment, a marriage that was doing everything correctly and producing, in the process, two people who were increasingly strangers to themselves. I had said nothing. I had thought I might be wrong. I had hoped I was wrong. By the 4th year I knew I was not wrong, but Ellen and I were barely speaking by then, and the thing I might have said had no route to travel. Ellen and I had grown up together in Ohio and had come to Colorado together in 1878, the pair of us, because Ellen wanted to go west and I had no particular reason not to. We had both found work, she at the schoolhouse, I at the general store, and we had both found men, which was easier in Colorado in 1878 than in Ohio, because the ratio favored us. I had found Thomas in October of that year, steady and straightforward, and had understood within 6 months that he was the kind of man you could build a life with, and that building a life with him would be a reasonable thing to do. Ellen had found Robert in November, and had understood within 6 months that she loved him, which is different from the kind of understanding I had had. I liked Robert. He was intelligent and serious, and he had a dry way of speaking that I enjoyed. He was not the wrong man in the way of being a bad man. He was the wrong man in the way that a coat is the wrong coat, correct in every technical specification and somehow not quite right when you put it on. I saw this. I had seen it for the entire year before the wedding. I had said nothing because Ellen had not asked, and because I might have been wrong, and because the thing I could see, the not quite rightness, was the kind of thing that a person in love cannot see about themselves, and saying it would have been taken as opposition rather than observation. I made the choice to say nothing. I have thought about that choice a great many times. The wedding was in June of 1880, a Tuesday, in the church in Linden with the pastor and the congregation and Ellen in white and Robert in his good coat and me standing to the side as the witness with the pen for the register and the very clear feeling of a woman who is watching something happen and is too late to stop it and was perhaps never the right person to try. Robert looked at me once during the ceremony. It was brief, the kind of look that is not meant to be seen but is, and it lasted approximately 2 seconds before I looked away. What was in the look I did not entirely understand at the time. I understood it as complicated. I did not understand it as what it actually was, which I only learned from Ellen 5 years later. In the weeks after the wedding, something changed between Ellen and me. Not dramatically, no argument, no confrontation, just a cooling, a slight withdrawal, conversations that had always gone deep beginning to stay on the surface. I thought it was the natural result of a new marriage, the reorganizing of a woman's life around a husband and home, the necessary pulling inward. I thought it was something that would resolve itself when things settled. It did not resolve itself. Over the following year it continued to cool, and the year after that further. And by the 3rd year we saw each other monthly and spoke of practical things, and the warmth was present but formal, a warmth that had learned to maintain its own distance. By the 4th year I had stopped trying to understand it and had decided to accept it, which is what you do when you love someone and cannot reach them and cannot identify the reason. Thomas said once, in the 4th year, that he thought Ellen was angry at me. I said I didn't know why she would be. He said he didn't know either. But that anger was sometimes how people managed things they couldn't say directly. I thought about this for a week and came to no conclusions and put it back where I kept the other things I could not solve. She knocked on the last Tuesday of October, 1885, in the evening, when Thomas was at the store finishing the accounts and I was alone in the front room with my mending. I opened the door. She was there in a dark traveling coat with her honey blonde hair loose from what had been a pinned arrangement and her brown eyes very direct, the way they had always been when she had made a decision and arrived at the far end of it. I said, "Ellen." She said, "Can I come in?" I let her in. I made tea, because that is what you do, and we sat at the kitchen table and I looked at her and she looked at her hands and I waited because she had come with something and I was not going to take it from her before she was ready to give it. She said, "I knew." And there it was, the thing I had been organizing my explanation for since I heard the knock. I began it. I said her name as a way of beginning. I said, "What happened at the ceremony?" She said, "That's not what I mean." I stopped. She said, "I knew from the beginning, from before the ceremony. I knew that I was making a mistake and I married him anyway because I was 28 and I had been afraid for 28 years. And it felt like the last reasonable chance, and I thought," she paused, "I thought that love was something you decided on, and that if I decided hard enough it would become the kind of love I wanted." She looked at her tea. She said, "It didn't. And I have known that for 4 years, but I couldn't say it because saying it would have meant admitting that everyone who had looked at me with that expression at the wedding was right." I said, "What expression?" She said, "The one you had, and Robert." I said, "I don't know what expression I had." She said, "Yes, you do." I sat with this. The kitchen was quiet, the Colorado autumn outside pressing against the windows, the lamp between us. I thought about the ceremony and about the look I had had and about what it had actually been, and I understood for the first time that Ellen had spent 5 years believing that look was something specific, something about Robert and me, and that the distance between us had grown from that belief. I said, "Ellen, there was nothing between Robert and me." She said, "I know that now." I said, "Then what did you think?" She said, "I thought he looked at you because he wished he were marrying you instead. I thought you looked away because you wished it too." I said nothing for a moment. I said, "That's not what it was." She said, "I know. Robert told me. He told me what the look was, what he was seeing in your face, what you were both seeing. I said, "What was he seeing?" She said, quietly, "He was seeing that I wasn't sure. He had known for 3 months that I wasn't sure, and he had asked me twice and I had told him I was, and he had believed me because he wanted to. And at the ceremony he looked at you because you were the person who knew me best in the world, and he needed to see if what he had told himself, that it was nerves, that it was normal, was true, and your face told him it wasn't." The lamp moved in a draft from the window. Outside, the Colorado October was doing what it did, cold and clear and indifferent. I said, "I didn't know that's what he was asking." She said, "No, but you answered it anyway." I sat with everything that had just been rearranged. 5 years. Ellen had spent 5 years angry at the wrong thing, and in the absence of the right explanation she had created a story that put the distance between us at something other than the actual source of it. And the actual source of it, what she had known and married and lived with for 5 years, was her own choice, made with full knowledge, out of fear. I said, "You knew at the ceremony." She said, "Yes." I said, "And you married him anyway." She said, "Yes." I said, "And you've been—" and then I didn't finish the sentence because the end of it was too large for one word. She said, "Leaving is hard when you're the one who chose wrong, because it means admitting the choice. It means," she stopped, "it means everyone who saw it will have been right, and you will have to stand in that." I said, "I wasn't judging." She said, "I know that now too." I got up and made more tea, because the tea was an excuse to stand up and turn my back for a moment and let my face do what it needed to do without being watched. When I came back to the table, she was looking at her hands again, and something in the set of her shoulders was different from when she had arrived. Lighter, in the specific way of a thing set down after a long carrying. I sat down. I said, "Is it done? The marriage?" She said, "I've been at my sister's for 3 weeks. The papers are being drawn." I said, "Where will you go?" She said, "I don't know yet. Somewhere I haven't decided anything wrong."
You keep it safe.
I said,
"I will,
"That sounds
thank
like
you."
a good requirement." She almost laughed. It was the first
Come
real
inside
sound
now.
in the room that wasn't about the weight of things. I said, "Ellen, why did you pull away from me after the wedding? If it wasn't about Robert and me, why the distance?" She said, "Because you knew. I could see that you knew. And being near someone who knows what you are pretending not to know is—" She paused. "It's exhausting. It's like trying to maintain a lie in front of someone who has the original truth." I said, "I never tried to make you feel that way." She said, "I know you didn't. That's the strange part. You were being kind. You were giving me room to be wrong in peace. And it felt like—" She looked at the teacup. "It felt like you were waiting for me to figure it out myself, and I couldn't. I couldn't figure it out myself with you watching, because every time I saw you I felt the weight of what you knew and hadn't said, and it was easier not to see you." I said, "I didn't know that's what I was doing to you." She said, "I know. That's the other strange part. We managed, between the two of us, to be very kind to each other and to hurt each other fairly significantly in the process." I said, "I never said anything." She said, "I know. That's also why. Because you loved me enough not to say it, and I couldn't decide whether that was kindness or whether it was the thing I most needed you to say." This was the question I did not have a clean answer to, whether I should have said something 5 years ago, whether the love I had thought I was showing by staying quiet was actually a failure of a different kind. I have thought about it since, I still think about it, and I have not resolved it, which I believe may be the correct state for it to be in. What I have resolved is this: she is here. She sat at my kitchen table in October, and she told me the truth of 5 years, and I told her what the look had actually been. Not desire, not rivalry, just grief. The grief of watching someone I loved walk towards something that wasn't right, and having no mechanism to stop it that would have worked. And she listened, and we drank the second pot of tea, and by the time Thomas came home from the store she was still at the table and there was nowhere she needed to be. She stayed 3 days. The first day was mostly talking, the kind of talking that happens when 5 years of things pile up and finally get the space they need. We talked about the marriage and about Robert, who was not a villain. She was clear about this and I believed her, but who was a man she had loved into the wrong shape and who had let himself be loved that way because it was easier than the alternative. We talked about the wedding and the ceremony and what she had seen in the look and what she had concluded from it and what Robert had finally told her last spring when she had asked him directly. Not that he had feelings for me, but that he had known on the wedding day that the marriage was a mistake and had married her anyway because she wanted it, and he didn't know how to refuse something that someone he cared about wanted so much. We talked about choices made from fear, which was the category that covered most of what had happened, including some of my own choices, the choosing of Thomas, which I examined in the privacy of my own thoughts during those 3 days and found to be a choice made from love and practicality in approximately equal measure, which I decided was adequate and perhaps better than what I had been calling it. She slept in the guest room and ate at our table, and on the second day she and Thomas talked for 2 hours about the dry goods business while I did the accounts, which is the specific kindness of a good husband who understands without being told that a woman's oldest friend needs to feel at home somewhere. On the third day she said she was going to her cousin in Denver while things settled. She said she would write. I said I would write back. These were not the kinds of promises we had needed to make before, which told me something about what the 5 years had cost both of us and what we had decided about getting it back. She left in the afternoon, the Colorado October still cold and clear around the wagon. I stood on the porch until she was out of sight, which Thomas watched from the doorway. He said, "Better." I said, "Much better." He said, "I told you she was angry at you." I said, "You told me that in the 4th year." He said, "I know. I'm noting that I was correct." I said, "You are occasionally correct." He said, "More than occasionally." I went inside. The guest room had the particular warmth of a room that has just had someone in it and still carries the residue of their presence. I stood in the doorway for a moment and thought about 22 years of knowing someone and 5 years of almost losing them and 3 days of getting them back. Then I went to the kitchen and started on the supper, which needed doing and which was easier to do now than it had been before she knocked. Some things you can only say to the person who knew you first. Some things have to wait until both of you are ready to hear them. And some silences, the long ones, the ones that feel like a permanent condition, turn out to have a door in them. You just have to wait for someone to knock. That was the whole of it. That was everything.